It's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I have a fun one with you. This is about stamping in embossing powder. Now for this technique, you are going to need some things. You're going to need heavyweight white cardstock. I am using die cuts most of the time here. This is an oval die cut. You're going to need embossing powder and you're going to need rubber stamps. These need to be red rubber or just rubber stamps to do this technique. If you use clear stamps, you're going to ruin your stamps. It won't work. For my embossing powders, I am using the Imagine embossing powders. And I do want to mention that this technique is not my own. I seen this technique done on Gail Thompson's The Darby Creek Diaries, her YouTube channel. I will leave her video and YouTube channel link down below in the description box so you can go check it out. That being said, let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that you've seen me do was actually add on a handle to my die cut. Use really good adhesive for this. This is what's going to keep you from burning your fingers because as you're adding more and more layers of embossing, it's going to stay hotter longer. If you accidentally touch this, it's like touching hot glue. Think about how that burns your fingers. It hurts and it burns you. So keep that handle on there. I'm just using chipboard with some strong adhesive. Now the first thing I did was use my sticky clear embossing ink. I'm using Versamark here. Use whatever you have on hand, but just place that all over your piece of cardstock that you're working on. I'm working on an oval die cut today. You also want to make sure you're using a nice heavyweight cardstock, something that can hold up to a lot of layers of embossing powder. This is going to get heavy, it's going to get bulky, and it will get a little bit rigid from all those layers of essentially plastic on top of each other. So make sure you're using a nice, good, heavyweight cardstock. Once you have that covered with embossing powder, it's time to add your first layer of many. I started with silver and then I heat set it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add 2 more layers of silver embossing powder. All in all, for this project, I added 12 layers of embossing powder. On all of my projects, I added anywhere from 12 to 15 layers of embossing powder. You want a nice thick surface of embossing to stamp into. So just keep layering this up. You can do different colors like I'm doing here. You can do a combination of different colors. You can do a pattern or you can do all one color. It really is up to you. This is a fun technique to get creative with. After I did my 3 layers of silver, I went in with 3 layers of another color. This is metallic berry, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a nice metallic berry color. It's really, really pretty, and I thought it would look nice with the stamps I'm using today from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. So again, I'm heat setting these layers, and I ended up doing 3 layers of this as well. Once I had that 3rd layer on, then it's time for my next color. Now I wanted to show you something. Sometimes they say that while it's still hot, you can lay it down and just sprinkle embossing powder over it. I don't really like doing that. What I find whenever I do that is things turn out really weird and lumpy. It's not a nice even layer of embossing powder like you get whenever you smush down your ink pad on top of it. So here I just heated up my last layer of embossing powder and then sprinkled on copper embossing powder. You can see I've got different textures going on. It sticks more in different places, and then once that embossing powder is on there, you need to heat set it super quick for it to stay. Once that embossing powder underneath it starts to dry, it won't hold on to it anymore and it will all fall off. Or when you bring your heat gun to it, it's all going to blow off. So I like to just go ahead and use my embossing pad each and every time. That being said, as you start to add more and more layers on top of this, it takes a little while for it to cool down and for it to dry to where you can go back in and smush it down on, or smush your ink pad down on top of it. So this is a good technique to have multiples going at once. So while you're waiting for the one you just heat set to cool down, you could move on to another one and add the powder to that and heat set it, let it cool down while you work on another one, and kind of go in that kind of order. Now after I added my metallic berry, you've seen on top of that I put copper. I put 3 layers of copper embossing powder on top of that. And finally, I am finishing off with something different. This is actually a clear matte embossing powder. It's going to give this project a really different look. So you can see as I heat set this, it's very shiny when I heat set it, but once it starts to dry, it takes on this matte look. It almost gives it a more distressed look. You can see the different colors and the copper underneath it. I don't know, it's just a really neat look. So all in all, I added 3 layers of that on top of my copper. So I ended up with 12 layers of embossing powder on top of this die cut. So here's a breakdown of the layers. 12 layers, I did 3 silver, 3 metallic berry, 3 copper, and 3 of the matte clear. Very, very simple on this one. 3 of each layer, that's it. So now, once I had my last layer of my clear matte embossing powder, I'm going to go ahead and heat set it completely, making sure that the entire area has been heat set and all the powder is melted. Once that powder is melted, I am going to take my heat gun and heat up the entire die cut. You need to move quickly here. The embossing powder starts to cool down as soon as you move your heat gun away from it. You can see that shine starting to go away. So it's going to start to cool very quickly. You need to go ahead and while it's still warm, take your rubber stamp and press it. Now, I was very gentle with my pressing at first. You don't need to be. You can see as I lift it up here, I didn't get the greatest impression. That is okay. It didn't work out the greatest on the first time. It's not completely ruined. Embossing powder levels itself out, so all I needed to do was go ahead and heat this up again, level everything back out, and then place my stamp in it again. So super easy to fix your mistakes with this one. So as you're sitting there adding all those layers of embossing and then you get to that last step and you don't want to ruin it, if it doesn't work out, it's okay. You can go back in and fix it and try again as many times as you want. Just don't burn your embossing powder overheating it too many times. So once I had that, I pressed it in there again, and this time I was a little bit more forceful, and I ended up with this really, really fun tulip impression. The stamp I used is from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. It's called Tulips, and you can see it gave a really, really nice impression. You can see some of those layers of the metallic berry under there. You've got some shine, you've got some dullness from the matte. And then something I found that works really well with this, especially with this distress look, if you take this while it's still pretty warm, or after it's cooled down a little bit, but still a little warm, you need to just start flexing it and it will crack on its own. If you don't want that cracking, you need to be gentle with it. Put something flat on top of it and a little heavy to keep it from curling up. But if you want that crack look, just start bending and you'll get this great distressed crack look in your background. You can see it here. It's really fun to add to your more distressed looking pieces. So there is a closer look. You can see the nice detail of the tulips in the embossing powder. I got some nice cracks going on from just simply bending my piece of cardstock. And then I finished this card off really, really simply. I added a little bit of stenciling to my A2 top folding card base. I used a quatrefoil stencil from the Crafters Workshop and sugared lavender ink from Catherine Pooler. I added on my little embossed piece, and then on top of that, I added just a note, a little flag banner to complete this card and add my sentiment. Super, super simple and easy. Now let's move on to the next one. This is a fun one. I love the way this one turned out. So again, I am working with heavyweight white cardstock. I've added my little chipboard handle, and I'm just going to start adding embossing powder. So for this, I'm using 3 different embossing powders, and all in all, I ended up adding 15 layers of embossing powder. A lot of this embossing powder that I'm using now is glitter, which is a fun little addition to add to your embossed panels that you're working with here. So I started off with New Year's Eve, which is a black embossing powder with gold glitter in it. I did 3 layers of that first and foremost on that white piece of cardstock. Then on top of that, I'm going to add 2 layers of yellow embossing powder. I should mention that all of these embossing powders I'm using today are from Imagine. All the links that I'm using, or all the links to the products I'm using, will be down in the description box below. Now, next up, on top of that yellow, I put 2 layers of gold glitter. Then I went back to a layer of New Year's Eve to add a little bit more black into this panel. And this covered up the yellow really, really well. One thing I want to mention as I'm going through this technique is as you're building up those layers on top of each other, you want to remember to get the sides of your die cut or whatever cardstock you're working on. That is going to just help even this out and not make a nice ridge on the edge. It just ends up looking a little bit better on the finished piece. So make sure you're getting those edges and embossing them and taking your heat gun to them so the powder just doesn't flake off later on. So after my New Year's Eve, I went back to gold glitter. Then I did another layer of the yellow embossing powder like you see I'm doing here. And then on top of that, I did a layer of the gold glitter. I wanted a lot of glitter in this finished piece. Then I did 2 layers of yellow on top of the gold glitter. And finally, I'm going to finish off with 2 layers of the gold glitter on top of the yellow. And here you can see as I'm finishing up and adding all those last little layers here, I'm making sure to hit those edges and melt that embossing powder down so I don't get those really funny ridges. Here you can see just how thick this embossed panel is, and I'm not even done yet. The final thing was I added those 2 layers of gold glitter, so I had a nice glittery finish on the finished panel that I was working on here. And yes, when I was done, I had embossing powder and glitter everywhere. Finishing up, 15 layers were on this little circle. I did 3 New Year's Eve, 2 yellow gold glitters, New Year's Eve, gold glitter, yellow, gold glitter, 2 yellows, 2 gold glitters. There it is for the layers if you want to try and replicate this as well. So, final layer of gold glitter is going on. I want to make sure that all the powder is melted, even those sides. Heat it up one last time, and then firmly press in my honeycomb stamp. This is again from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. When I pull this up, you get this great honeycomb impression. Now, I did that in the center of the circle. And then what I did was I went back in with my heat tool and just continued to heat up those edges and lay in that stamp on the edges of the circle. That way I ended up with this really fun pattern that had no rhyme or reason to it on this circle that I was playing around with. I just wanted to see if this would work and if I could continue to lay and lay and lay the stamp in. It worked beautifully. Some of these are a little bit more shallow of an indentation. Some of these are really, really deep into that embossing, and I love the different looks that you get with this. So it's a lot of fun to play around. Something like this is great to do for your first time of this technique too, because then you can play around with the different pressures and see what works best for you. A lighter pressure or maybe a little bit more pressure is the look you're going for. This is a good one to play around with to see what you like and what look you want on your finished card. So once that was done, I did it a few more times because once I started this, I couldn't stop and I just wanted to add more and more and see how much I could actually do. I do want to say too, as I was doing this and lifting the stamp up, some of the embossing powder started to go over the edge of the die cut. That's okay. You can leave it as is, or you can take scissors while it's still warm and just trim it off. You want to get it when it's cooling down, it's a little bit warm, but it's not going to stick to your scissors. So there's a finished look at that piece. I love the way this one turned out. Not my favorite, but it's my second favorite. My favorite's the last one. But to finish this off, I kept it really, really simple. I added a black mat to that circle. Then I used the large B stamp from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. I fussy cut it out, added a little yellow coloring to it, and then finally I stamped the Because You're Special sentiment down at the bottom there in black ink. This one's super simple. I love the way it turned out, and I especially love that embossed piece that I created with all the glitter in it. It's so shiny in real life. Now, On to my last one. This was a complete happy accident. What I thought this was going to look like was not how it ended up at all, but I am so happy that I stumbled upon this. So the first thing I want to mention is that I am going to be using, again, heavyweight white cardstock. I've got my little handle on there, and I'm using just a regular rectangle this time. Now for this, I went in with rainbow colors. I did 2 of each color: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. 2 layers of each, all on that little rectangle that I'm working on now. Don't forget the edges. That's super important so you don't end up with a really kind of weird edge on your finished project. Now, once I had all of the different colors layered up, the last thing I did was add 3 layers of this opaque iridescent embossing powder. This is from Imagine as well. They also have just an iridescent, which has a clear base to it, and it's really gorgeous, but I went in with the white base so I could cover up all those colors, add a little bit of glitter to this finished project as well, and it just gives a nice look to the sky look I was trying to go for. So I ended up doing 3 layers of that on top of the purple just so I could get some really good coverage and I had no color peeking through whatsoever. All in all, I ended up with 15 layers on this one as well, just as I did on my previous one. I did 2 layers of each of the colors, like I said, and then I also added the opaque iridescent and I did 3 layers of that so I could get complete coverage over the colors. Now, here's where things took a wrong turn for me. I thought that whenever I pressed these butterfly stamps, which I absolutely love, it wasn't the stamp's fault. It was my fault for thinking this would work. But I placed these butterfly stamps into this white embossing powder and they're solid. I thought that I could get some rainbow peeking through once I did this, but all it did, because they're solid stamps, was press the white into the colors. I didn't end up with anything but a white background. That's okay. I thought I'll try it again, see if I can get some colors coming through once I've heated this up again. So I brought my heat gun back to it, heated it up, made sure it was as flat as I could get it. Then I laid the stamps in once again, and I thought I'll use an acrylic block so I can get some really good pressure and press this down in there and see if I can pull the colors up that way. Still didn't work. If you want the colors to peek through, you really need a more textured stamp than a solid stamp like I'm using here. But I thought, okay, well, it's not going to work. So I ended up just peeling up those butterflies, and I thought, well, it's not a complete lost project. I'll just see if I can kind of scrape up some of those colors to the top. So I grabbed these tools from Imagine. These have a silicone tip on them, so the embossing powder will not stick to them. It will peel right off once it's dry on there. I heated this panel up again, and then I started just using those silicone tips to pounce into my hot embossing powder. This is going to pull up all those layers and create a marbled look on the background. So you can do as little or as much as you like. You can scrape, you can just do dots like I'm doing here, you could do circles, you could do a pattern. Have you ever seen like the soap making commercials where they do the swirling on top? You could do that. You could use a toothpick if you don't have these silicone things and you don't want to harm any of your own tools. Just use a toothpick to swirl in there and make little dots. These are just awesome because the silicone tips on there, they won't burn, and once the embossing powder is dried on there, you can just peel it right off. Super simple and easy to do. And as you're doing this, you'll think you're making little hills and indentions in your embossing powder, but once you heat it up again and again, it just kind of levels itself out, which is a really, really nice feature of this. So you can see as I'm doing this, I'm pulling up some reds, some yellows, some of the greens and blues, quite a bit of the blues and purples because they were the top colors. So all in all, whatever color you want to show up the most, make sure that's your top layer. But this is a really fun way to create that marbled look on your background, and all you need is some embossing powder. If you wanted to, you could just do a few layers then and not press anything into it, and you've got a great marbled background. However, I went ahead and chose this background stamp from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. It's called Tulip. I will leave it linked down below, and I just pressed that right into the hot embossing powder. Let it cool over that embossing powder, and then once it has cooled and the embossing powder is set, this pulls right off of the embossing powder. It's not going to stick to your stamp at all, even when it is so gushy and wet. And as you can see, this embossing powder takes no time to dry. You can clean off your little silicone tools. It won't stick to them at all. And there you go. So if you don't have those, a toothpick will work though as well, and then you can just toss it when you're done. I went ahead and laid that tulip in there. Once it was dry, I pulled it up. And I did have some seepage off the edges. That's okay. While it's still warm, just use your scissors and trim that away. It trims away beautifully and creates a nice smooth edge. You could even use a sanding block to get that nice and smooth if you wanted to. But look at that. It is so cool. I'm so happy I stumbled up on it. Even when things don't work out, sometimes you find a new thing that you love even more. So for this one, I kept it very, very simple. I wanted that little rainbow marble look to shine on the background. I added a black mat to that embossed piece, and then over the top of that, I used a very small Thinking of You sentiment from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. I stamped that on a flag banner with some basic black Nocturne ink and applied everything to an A2 top folding card base to completely finish this card off. This one is by far my favorite finished card. I love the marbled look, and I love that this would work even if you don't want to layer up a ton of embossing powder. You could just do that marble with a few layers of embossing powder. A few things I want to finish up this very long video with is to say that this does not ruin your rubber stamps. It just peels right off if you do get any stuck to it like I did on the edge of these butterflies. It just scrapes right off. They are not ruined at all. You could also wash them very easily. But most of the time, it doesn't even stick to them. It just peels right away. Another thing, cleaning up the embossing powder, and especially the glitter embossing powder, can be kind of a pain. I like to use lint rollers, pet hair rollers, whatever you want to call it. Just a piece of masking tape would work as well. It sticks beautifully. Then you can just throw that away, and your mess is cleaned up. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check out Gail's original video on this technique. That is linked down in the description box below. Also in the box below is the complete supply list if you are interested in anything you've seen. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and happy crafting!